So, yep, today we are in chapter 17, and like I'd written, we are probably going to take a deeper look at one of the most well-known and familiar stories in the Old Testament. This is about David and Goliath, and it is so familiar and well-known, not just among Christians, even among non-Christians, that David and Goliath itself is a metaphor. It's a well-understood metaphor for situations where there is a confrontation between someone who's very strong and someone who's very weak. And the metaphor holds out hope for those who appear to be weak against very big enemies, right? So, but before we get into that, I think we should just take a quick overview of how we got to this point in our study. We'll just only go as far back as the last chapter, right? In 1 Samuel 16, we studied how God guides the choice of David, the youngest and the least regarded of Jesse's sons, as a king that he has selected for himself among Jesse's sons, right? And in David, we saw the Lord had found. Why had David been selected? Because the Lord had found in him a man after his own heart. And last time we saw one reason why David was the king that the Lord wanted for Israel rather than Saul. Saul is a person who Israel kind of would choose as a king, right? So, and one of the reasons was David was a shepherd king, right? He was someone who the Lord saw would care for his flock, like he himself cared for them, right? And as a shepherd, David's training as a shepherd taught him how, uh, gave him a deep understanding of the shepherd kind of relationship. So, one of the metaphors that the Lord always uses for his relationship with us, like he uses the relationship of a father and a son, another common relationship that he uses is a shepherd and his flock, right? And David's humble position as shepherd helps him really understand this shepherd like relationship that exhibits the concern the Lord has for his people, right? And we also saw towards the end of the last chapter how when the protective and empowering presence of the Holy Spirit is withdrawn from someone who's very disobedient and rebellious, which Saul becomes, how that person becomes vulnerable to the temptations and manifestations of the evil spirits that are around, right? The evil spirits are there always, but it's the hedge that the Holy Spirit puts around you that prevents you from being tormented by them, right? And we saw how the contrasting impact of the presence and absence of the Holy Spirit impacts every aspect of your physical and spiritual life, right? And we saw how important, therefore, it was to put on the armor of God, to be always prepared, because we battle not just against normal things, but against principalities and powers of the darkness, right? And one thing to note that we didn't call out particularly the last time was this anointing ceremony was a private ceremony. The only witnesses that we know of were Jesse and his sons, his family, when David was anointed. And we did not see Samuel actually calling out the reason for the anointing, right? So to Jesse and his sons, that is David's brothers, David has just been honored by Samuel, the man of God. Okay. So that's the context with which we will move into today's study. So today's study, like I said, is a study of an underdog versus top dog. What do the terms underdog and top dog mean? So in these fights that they have, these dog fights, right? There's one dog that wins, and usually the dog that wins ends up on top, right? And you grab the dog that's below by its throat or whatever. So that's where the top dog and underdog terms come about. Okay. So we know that I told you how David and Goliath has become a metaphor for the unequal contest where the unexpected happens, where the underdog, in this case David, meets the top, defeats the top dog, in this case Goliath, right? But one problem with stories like David and Goliath, some of these Old Testament stories like David and Goliath, Daniel in the lion's den, Jonah and the whale, all of these have become metaphors that hold a certain meaning for us. And we're also familiar with these stories that sometimes it's difficult to shift our perception, take a new look at it and learn something afresh. I say that particularly in today's story because if you read this chapter, all of I think 57 verses, 57 or 58 verses, you will notice that it's barely 10 verses, roughly 20% of the narrative, which actually describes the combat between David and Goliath, right? The chapter is about David and Goliath, but 80% of the narrative is the setting in which this combat occurs. So I think it's important that we focus on this 80% also, because that will allow us to set and to get a correct perspective, right? For example, in today's study, we'll take a look at it in some particular ways, right? We will relook at the story to see, when viewed from a biblical perspective, with an understanding of God's role in history, we will see, was David really the underdog or was it Goliath, right? First question. We tend to always say that it's underdog, David underdog, overcoming top dog Goliath. But was that really true, right? Particularly knowing how God intervenes in history, right? Second is, if we change our point of view or the perception, the angle from which we perceive the story, what does it tell us about the, so by changing the perspective, do we get a clear or a distorted perspective of the challenges we face? So the perspective from which you view something will either give you a clarity of the real nature of challenges, or it will give you a distorted picture of the challenges that face us, right? And when we are challenged, can we answer the question, what is it that is guiding our perception, right? Are we being guided by our faith? And the answer to that question very often makes all the difference with how we perceive our situation and how we address our situation. So this is a summary of how we will approach today's study. Okay. So when we get into the study, again, we are biting off large chunks. There's a large chapter. And the way the chapter is structured, I think from verse 55 onwards, actually is actually in the narrative, it is part of the next portion. So from 55 onwards, we'll deal with it in the next study. We will go all the way to 54. And that itself is a large set of verses to study. So the first section, we will bite off first 24 verses, okay? This deals with the Philistine challenge. The focus is on this challenge that Israel is facing. We see that in last chapter, David was anointed, but that has not made much difference in his profession. He is back to tending his father's sheep, or as his brothers refer to it, the few sheep that his father has asked him to look after. In addition, we know that he has a new part-time job also, right? He is Saul's musician comforter. Whenever Saul is tormented, it is David's role to play good music that will comfort him, right? And meanwhile, we see now Israel is under a threat by the Philistines again. This is nothing new. We saw this happening in earlier chapters. When remember this whole story we studied about Jonathan and Saul, right? That time also they were challenged by the Philistines. But this time there is a difference. The two armies seem to be more or less evenly matched. We are not hearing about the Israelites fleeing away in fear because the Philistines are very huge in number. But there is something new. The Philistines have played a trump card this time, right? A very big trump card in Goliath. And Israel appears to have no answer to the humiliating challenge. This trump card was that this huge Goliath would actually step up and ask for a representative winner takes it all, one-to-one combat with the Israelite champion, knowing fully well that there's no one in Israel of that stature, right? And this is humiliating, and Israel is under humiliation because of this, right? But you'll see that there is a stalemate and nobody is running away, right? So the first thing in this portion, I think the important thing is, can we get into the mind of Saul and Israel's army as they face this challenge that the Philistines throw at them? Clearly, they are intimidated, not by sheer numbers, but by size and power of someone who's challenging them, right? So let's get into the minds of Saul and Israel's army. What is it that is actually facing them that is intimidating them so much? That's the first question for us to explore. True. So let's dig into this a little deeper. So we'll just split it and look at it, try to organize it into different set of thoughts, right? First, let's look at the situation, right? In the last confrontation between the Philistines and Israelites, we saw how The Philistines far outnumbered the Israelites, so much so that they got so demoralized that they ran away. They deserted the army, and Saul was left with only a few handful of his warriors, right? This time around, they seem more well matched. They're evenly matched. Both the armies are positioned on opposing hills with the valley of Elah between them, right? Nobody is willing to concede the high ground. To If anyone has to attack the other, they'll have to descend the hill, enter into the valley, and then climb up to attack. We saw how Jonathan handled this, right? But none of these two armies are willing to do this, give up their advantage, because whoever's coming down and climbing up the hill is always going to be at a disadvantage. You can be cut down from above. So there is a deadlock. Nobody wants to give up their position. Nobody wants to take the initiative to attack, which is when the Philistines devise a way to break the deadlock. They send this giant champion, and they are setting the rules by which they say the combat should happen, right? So man to man, and they've even chosen the weapons, right, in an indirect way. So this man is there with a spear, with a sword, and with a javelin, right? And the challenge is, this is a common thing that happens those days, right? Like there are many historical situations and where such challenges were put up, right? And it was a winner takes it all challenge. The loser's army would surrender to the winning army. And we see that this challenge, this stalemate is present for 40 days before David appears on the scene. And in the Bible, we know that the number 40 often represents a period of testing. We saw that in the case of Moses. He had to spend 40 years in the desert learning to be a shepherd, right? And he had run away from the palace. And that was an important period of testing for him to temper his character. And then he had to lead Israel for 40 years in the wilderness. That was a period of testing for Israel to see whether they were ready to enter into the promised land. We saw how Jesus was tested for 40 days, right? Uh, in the wilderness again. So 40 represents a period of testing. It's a number that's very often used as a period of testing, right? The next perspective that we can adopt is, let's take a look at some statistics. Let's see what the Israelite army saw before them as a challenge. Different versions of the Old Testament have put the height of Goliath at different numbers, right? Some say 6 feet 9 inches. Some say 9 feet 9 inches. It depends on the text they have used to this one to translate, right? There can also be imprecision in this because this cubit is the measure from the elbow to the tip of the finger of a man's hand, and how you would measure that today might have been different from how you would measure it those days. Nonetheless, the two heights that are attributed to Goliath is either 6 feet 9 inches or 9 feet 9 inches. So the first question is, can someone be so tall, especially if it's 9 feet 9 inches? The answer is both are possible, right? 6 feet 9, we easily know it's possible because many NBA players or even cricketers today are close to 7 feet tall, right? As for 9 feet 9, in medical history, there's this person who was the tallest person on earth, right? Known person. In recent history, he was 8 feet 11 inches. And he was supposed to be still growing. He had a certain medical condition. He was still growing when he died at the age of 22. So probably if he lived a couple of years more, he would have crossed 9 feet. Who knows, right? So both are possible, either 9 feet 9 inches or 6 feet 9. So it's not just a tall tale, okay? Forgive the pun. The average estimated height of biblical Israelites, based on the fossil record and all of that, is about 5 feet 6 inches. We know, like Santosh said, and some of you called out, Saul was known to be a head taller. He was head and shoulder above all the other Israelites. So we could say Saul was probably about 6 foot tall, right? David, on the other hand, we know was not very tall, because in the last chapter, one of the things that God tells Samuel is not to consider Eliab and David's elder brothers. He says, don't go by their height or appearance. So it's like priming Saul for someone who's going to be shorter than Eliab and the other brothers, right? So this implies that David was probably not as tall. Perhaps he was even less than the average height of an Israelite. We do not know, right? So let's say David was probably 5.5 feet tall, which puts him at the lower end of the scale, at least 1.5 foot shorter than Goliath, or perhaps even 3 feet shorter than Goliath. Then we know that Goliath had impressive armor and weaponry that weighed nearly 65 kgs, going by the biblical description, right? He had a spear, he had a bronze javelin, he had a sword. He also had a shield bearer walking ahead of him, which is actually rather strange, but we will discuss why that is strange later. Okay, so this is how the Israelite army statistically perceived the challenge ahead of them. What was Saul's approach? We know that Saul was probably the best candidate to take on Goliath, yet he chose to stay in the background, like how Santosh told us, right? And instead, he tries to motivate and entice somebody else to take up the challenge with rewards. He offers wealth, he offers his daughter's hand in marriage, he offers even tax exemptions, right? Saul is desperate. We know that he is someone who put a lot by his honor, personal honor, and how he was perceived by the people. So he is desperate to salvage his and Israel's honor, right? And a manifestation of his desperation is in the person he finally allows to take up the challenge, right? He allows David to go up and take up the challenge. That is, in David, we have a young man, a young boy who was not even old enough to be the army. So probably he was about 19 years. He was inexperienced. He had never been formally militarily trained. Saul is so desperate that he's willing to send David out against a bigger, better armed and trained warrior. Okay. The next approach thing that we have to look at is how is the Israelite army approaching this? Probably every one of them are wondering why their king and leader Saul does not take up the challenge. So they're a headless army, right? They see a heavily armored and armed Goliath ahead of them in the army, and David looks to them as far as appearances go and as far as his sound goes. He looks and seems and sounds as brave and fierce as he tries to appear to be, right? And they do not have the courage to engage Goliath in a combat based on the rules that Goliath seems to have set. Goliath seems to have set a rule of engagement, which is let's fight man to man by either spear, javelin, or sword. And none of them are willing to take up this challenge. So the sheer size of the challenge facing them, even though it's across the valley, so they're looking and evaluating this challenge from a distance, right? And the sheer size is more intimidating than any reward that is on offer. No one is willing to stake his reputation, especially when the king himself is not willing to do so, in a cannot win challenge. Everyone is waiting for somebody else to pick up the challenge and they're gossiping. This is the reward. This is the reward. Who's going to take this up? Okay. So this is the context in the first section. In the next section, verses 25 to 40, we see David appearing on the scene and he's actually going to apply for this job and he gets it, right? David, if you read that portion, looks like a very unwanted element in the battlefield. His brothers treat him with contempt. They even ask him, why are you here? Can't you just leave what you're supposed to do and go and look after that few sheep that you're responsible for? David actually is sent to the battlefield. His father sends him to the battlefield, right? Because God knows he's the right man for this job. So David does what his father wants him to. He delivers the goodies and the supplies that he's carrying to the quartermaster, the supply officer, and then he hastens to get a ringside view of the battle, right? The big difference between David and the rest of Israel's army is in the way David perceives the challenge, right? Some aspects of David's evaluation of the challenge are obvious when we read this portion, and some are not so obvious. But all of them are very important, as later events will prove, right? So the question before us is, if you have read this portion carefully, what was David's perception of the Philistine challenge? How did it differ from how Saul, his brothers, and the rest of the army perceived the challenge? So that's the next question for us to look at. What is David's different perception of the Philistine challenge? And how is it different from the perception of the others? That is, the King Saul, his brothers, and the rest of the army. Okay, so let's just a minute. I tend to save all the comments. Let's get into this in a little more depth. Again, like before, let's look at it from various angles. First, let's see, what did David see? What is David seeing on the battlefield, right? David first sees the armies of the Israelites and the Philistines staring down each other from opposite hillsides. And he makes an assessment. He also is there in time to see Goliath do his normal routine, 40-day routine of coming up and challenging and cursing and insulting the Israelites, right? And he makes an assessment of the challenge and insults that the Philistine throws, right? In his eyes, Goliath is just an uncircumcised Philistine, a man outside the covenant relationship with the Lord. So, first, what does it reveal to us? One is the lens through which David is viewing Goliath is the lens of his relationship and his knowledge of the relationship God has with Israel and with his people, a covenant relationship, right? So he sees that Goliath is an enemy. He's outside this covenant relationship. Second, he sees Goliath insulting the passive, trembling people of the covenant. He's seeing Israel as people of the covenant, people that belong to the living God, right? The circumcised people. So he's not just seeing people, my brothers or the army. His concern is wider, and his concern is centered on this, again, the relationship his Lord has with his people, right? Then he sees Goliath defying God. In challenging and defying Israel, he sees clearly that Goliath is defying God by challenging and insulting God's army, right? Because he says the living God is the armies of the living God. Israel's armies, the armies of the living God. So in effect, he sees Goliath as defying God, right? And then he sees an army that has forgotten that theirs is a living God. So why the word living God as against a dead God or just God, right? He knows that his God, the living God, is someone who would surely intervene and fight with and for those within his covenant relationship. So we see how David is viewing this entire challenge from God's lens, from a God-shaped lens, and from a God relationship-shaped lens. And he's puzzled by why the others cannot see this, right? So that actually reveals something about his persistent questioning also. So let's just take a deviation and see how is David being perceived by his brothers and probably the rest of the enemy armies, the Israelite army. To the veteran soldiers, David comes across like an ignorant, arrogant, irritating person. Someone who's actually like that child in their emperor's new clothes who's speaking out uncomfortable truths, right? So these veterans are skeptical about David. They say David's speaking like a child. What does an untrained shepherd know about battles and rushing into duels that can end only one way? What does David know about fighting with a spear or a javelin or a sword against someone who's this big as Goliath was, right? But David's persistent questions, we see him asking this question again and again to different people, even though he's asked to shut up, even though he's told, hey, you're a child, go and tend to the sheep that you're asked to look after. His questions are persistent. And if you look deeper and from that God perspective that David has, his persistent inquiries are really a question that they do not want to confront. And his question is, why is it that no one has the confidence to take on this insulting, uncircumcised Philistine? Don't you know that he's uncircumcised and therefore not someone who is within the covenant relationship? And you are set apart. And you are the army of the living God. So that's what his question is, was consistently bringing out this fact, and they don't want to confront that. Okay. What was Saul's perception, right? As soon as the news reaches Saul that David seems to be charged up about this, and David is asking these questions, and David is probably even saying in many ways that he can take on this challenge, though he vocally, literally states it only after Saul brings him in, right? So Saul sees something that makes him summon David, right? He already knows David as a musician, right? As his armor bearer, someone who can offer him comfort. And in David, he's now seeing someone who can do more than just that, right? So he calls David and David applies for the job, right? He says, here is this job opening and I'm willing to take it on. I am willing to fight to save Israel's honor. And Saul initially does not see in David a good candidate. What he sees is a young boy with no related experience or training to take on a mission critical job of defending Israel's honor, right? And he says as much. But David makes a persuasive case. He's not someone who's going to give up. This job interview initially is not going well, but he persists, right? And he wants to shift the perspective. He therefore makes a persuasive self and a situational evaluation of his experience, right? He tells Saul that even as a shepherd, he has been exposed to bears and lions that threaten his flock, right? And bears and lions are far stronger and agile, more agile than he is. And so he's exposed to challenges of that nature. And then it says, he demonstrates through his words how, with the weapons at his disposal, that is his staff, his sling, and his hands, bare hands, he has overcome the challenges that the bears and the lions posed, right? And he makes an equivalence relationship and he says, this uncircumcised Philistine is no greater a threat than a lion or a bear. So if I am willing to put my life on the line to serve my master as a shepherd, my father entrusted me with his sheep, and I was willing to put my life on the line to protect my flock. And Saul, you are my king. I am willing to put, and the Lord is the commander of the army. This people that my people belong, the people I belong to the Lord. How much more willing will I be to put my life on the line for my master, the Lord, right? And he says that as a faithful shepherd, he's always been accountable to the living God for his flock, right? He says that that's what a faithful shepherd would do. He would always be accountable to the living God. And as a challenger, he would be accountable to the same living God. He's the real commander. So he says, if I'm allowed to enter into the battle, I will be accountable to the real commander of the armies of Israel, right? And he knows that the living God is not just a passive accountant to whom you give an account. He knows that the living God is an empowering and a participatory God who will deliver those he sets out on a mission for him, right? So these are the things that he argues to shift Saul's perspective, and he succeeds in doing that, right? Then Saul tries to empower David. He tells him, okay, so if you're going to go out into battle, so be it. But let me at least do something for you to prepare you the best that I can, right? So he does his best to prepare Saul for his encounter. But he totally misses all the messages that David gave him just now, right? About the living, empowering God who's the commander of the living armies, the living of the armies of Israel, right? So Saul offers David his best armor and weapons, which is his own. Earlier, we know the Philistines did not even allow the rest of the army to have weapons, right? They had put up barriers for that. So Saul offers his own armor and weapons. David actually sees this offer for what it is. He rejects the temptation to see the upcoming challenge through Saul's eyes. When Saul was offering his armor and his weapons, he was seeing the battle and he was trying to make David see the battle through his conventional eyes. And David rejects his temptation, right? He sees that the king's armor and weapons are not what will give him his best chance. They are too uncomfortable, right? And David decides instead that his own familiar weapons and training that he has already received as a shepherd are not without meaning and purpose. So David chooses to enter into battle with no physical body armor, but with a spiritual armor on, right? And David chooses his own weapons, that his station in life where God positioned him and trained him with certain weapons, that is his staff, his hands, and the slingshot. And he decides that these are the weapons he needs when he enters into a battle with the living Lord, right? Saul, actually with no conviction at all, actually blesses. He goes through the motion and he blesses David, says, go, the Lord will be with you. But David's conviction that the Lord is with him comes from his personal knowledge of the Lord, right? In verse 37 and 47, twice he emphasized, the Lord is with me because this battle belongs to the Lord. So we see the difference in the perception, how David is perceiving things, right? And how he uses his knowledge and his training. So with that, let's just move into the next question. The last question for us, the verses 41 to 54 is, the battle belongs to the Lord, right? As David decides to engage Goliath, he actually does a paradigm change, right? He decides to engage Goliath not on Goliath's terms. He sees no reason why he should do that. He decides to engage Goliath in his own terms, right? And when he does that, we are called to examine Goliath a little more closely. Perhaps this giant is a mirage, and he is not all that he appears to be. Or, as we all know, David brings down Goliath with one pebble from his slingshot and kills him, right? But we must ask this question: what has changed? What can we see? What is it that David sees in Goliath? And how is it that he has a clearer vision of Goliath and the challenge than everybody else? Or was David actually being very foolish? Was he rushing in where angels fear to tread? Was he being foolhardy when he rushed into the challenge? We know that David stepped into the combat on faith. So, on what foundation had David built his faith? Were there strong foundations on which he stepped out into combat, or was it just blind faith? So, read this portion, see what David sees, right? And read this portion to see, is actually Goliath really a giant? Is he a top dog? Who's the man at an advantage here? Okay, so that's the last question for us to look at here. What was the faith, the foundation on which David's faith was built that allowed him to enter into combat with Goliath? That's the next question. Anyway, let's just get into this portion. Yeah, the 5 pebbles is a question that a lot of people pose, actually, and that's an interesting perspective. His perception of the fullness of the challenge, right? So let's ask ourselves the question: whose perception of the challenge was correct? Saul's, the Israelite army, or David's? To do that, let's first look at David's resume once more. How did David perceive and present his encounter with the lions and the bears? He knew clearly that lions or bears are physically stronger. He's not operating under any illusion. However, he knows that this physically stronger and more agile enemy needs to be, the lion and the bear needs to be within physical striking distance to leverage their speed and strength. So he's got a clear analysis, right? It's not just blindly that he's rushing into something. He knows the advantage that his weapon offers, right? The power of the slingshot allows him to engage the enemy from a distance, like how he engaged the lion and the bear. Before they could reach within striking distance where they had an advantage, he could strike them, right? Therefore, with his weapons, he could eliminate the advantage that the superior agility and the strength of the enemy had, right? And then his skill with the slingshot made the slingshot a powerful precision weapon, a long range weapon in his hands. He could deliver a fatal strike from a distance. Statistically, there are a lot of accounts in history where a slingshot could hurl a stone. So this is not that slingshot that we as kids have, right? That V-shaped thing through which we shoot out something. The slingshot is a leather thong. There's a pocket with 2 leather straps attached to it. One of the straps normally has a hook to which you put a finger, and the other you hold it in the hand. And in this pocket, you put a stone, and then you twirl it around your head until you pick up a lot of momentum, and then you release that one strap, and that hurls the stone at a huge speed, calculated at close to 160 to 300 kilometers based on the skill of the person who's using the slingshot. And there are pictures of master slingers hitting a bird in flight. In fact, even in Judges, we saw that, I think it was the Benjaminites who were very skilled with the sling. Was it the Benjaminites or some of, and they were said that they could even, they could hit it within the hair's breadth, their targets, right? I forgot the reference, exact reference, but in Judges, there's a reference to slingers who can hit a target within a hair's breadth. David, therefore, was not just operating under illusions. He had a clear assessment of what his advantages were and what the advantages were and how to overcome the advantages of the enemy. And David knew, he was smart enough to know that he could leverage the lessons he has learned as a humble shepherd to the challenge that Goliath possessed, right? So we see God moving in a wonderful way. Through David's father, he's sending him to the battlefield. He's sending the right man for the right job, right? David knows that he can take away Goliath's advantage of size and weapons by changing the rules of engagement. He knew that he does not, there is nothing that says he has to engage Goliath within arm's reach or within the reach of a javelin and a sword. He could engage him at a distance with this weapon that he had, right? So when David decides to engage the giant, we also realize in that portion of the narrative that perhaps Goliath is not all that he appears to be in our initial reading. Some questions. Why does Goliath need a shield bearer to walk ahead of him? We're told twice that as he moves, then his shield bearer is walking ahead of him. Santosh said it's probably because he wants to throw the javelin from behind and protect himself from the javelin of the enemy. That could be one, or there could be other reasons. One of his weapons is a sword, and a swordman never has a separate shield bearer, right? You use your sword in one hand and the shield in the other. So perhaps the reason why he has a shield bearer walking ahead of him with the shield is because he needs somebody to show him the path. There is something that says that he cannot see this path that he has to go very clearly. Second question is, multiple times we are told that Goliath is approaching David slowly and slowly, stealthily he is approaching, getting closer and closer to David, rather than charge at him with speed and force. Why is Goliath seeming to move slowly and stealthily? After all, he's going against a small boy, right? Why does Goliath, we see Goliath when he hurls his insults and scorn at David, he asks him, are you coming at me like you're going at a dog with sticks? In plural, right? And we are told earlier that David takes up a staff, singular, in his hand. So David has a staff, but Goliath is seeing sticks, right? So when you put this together, there are papers, medical condition. There's a medical condition and papers published on it, which talks about this disease called acromegaly, which results in gigantism. That is huge growth. And this gigantism, it's because of a condition of the pituitary glands. It causes people to grow very huge. That tallest man I talked about, and there are many such men who are 8 feet plus, who are all affected by this condition called acromegaly. There's a side effect of this condition, and the side effect is it impacts the mobility and agility of the person, as well as the vision. So when you put this knowledge that we have today of this condition called acromegaly with the narrative that we have from several thousands years ago, we can ask this question: was Goliath actually suffering then from what we know today is acromegaly, right? So probably this giant, if you had gone closer and looked closer, you would have seen that he's probably not as big a giant as he seems to be from a distance, right? So, and then we also see that David sees the purpose of the battle differently. He's not seeing just the rewards, but he's seeing that the glory of the Lord should be known to all the assembly, right? And David's purpose statement is there in verses 45 to 47, right? He tells Goliath, you are coming against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I am coming against you in the name of the Lord of the heavens armies, the God of Israel, Israel's army whom you have defied. This very day, the Lord is going to deliver you into my hand. Then all the land will realize that Israel's God, Israel as a God, and this assembly will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's and he will deliver you into our hand, right? So he's stating his purpose statement very clearly. So in addition to his ability to analyze the physical situation, in addition to his ability and wisdom to change the rules of engagement, he also has a very clear spiritual perspective of what he's getting into, right? So here are some key takeaway lessons from this. One, as David saw, the Lord our God is a living, not a dead God. He is a God who intervenes on behalf of his people. Second, seeks the Lord's purpose to choose your battles well. Don't rush into battles. Seek whether this is the Lord's purpose for your life. When you fight the Lord's battle, then remember that battle belongs to the Lord, right? So let your knowledge of the Lord guide you, because the fear of the Lord, whenever the Bible talks about the fear of the Lord, it's talking about this fear that comes from the knowledge that you have an awesome God. So it's a fear that comes from the knowledge of the Lord. The fear of the Lord always trumps the fear of your giants that face you, right? And the Lord has been at work in your past, preparing you whenever you're faced with the giant. The Lord, look at your past. The Lord has been working in you and on you in your past, preparing you for the challenges if he has put a challenge before you in the present or in the future. So in all that you do today, be faithful. because every challenge and difficulty that you face today makes you stronger for what the Lord has for you tomorrow. Okay, so these are some key takeaway lessons. And we know that David foreshadows Jesus, and a lot of it comes out in this chapter, right? Both David and Jesus are representative of their people. Whatever happens to the representative also happens to God's people, right? Both David and Jesus fought when their enemy was able to dominate the people of God through fear and intimidation. Both David and Jesus are sent to the battleground by their father. Both David and Jesus were scorned and rejected by their own brethren when they entered into the battle. Both David and Jesus fought the battle without concern for human strategies or conventional wisdom, right? Both David and Jesus fought a battle where victory was assured even before the battle started, right? So we saw a young David, but we see a young David who had learned invaluable lessons from the humble jobs that he was given during his life, right? And we saw how God was in work in David's past, preparing him for the future. We saw how God used his shepherding days. We saw how God took him to the palace to prepare for his kingship days. And we saw how God brings him to the battlefield because he was the right man. He was equipped just the right way for this particular challenge, right? And this is a lesson over and over again we see in the Old Testament. We saw when Moses was first called, he responded, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" And the same Moses, many years and many experiences later, and much stronger in his faith, encourages Joshua by telling him, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened. Do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." And Moses was standing on the foundation of his knowledge, awesome knowledge of the Lord, right? Knowledge of the awesome Lord. So this is our question for the breakout session. Reflect on the experience of your past situations and the challenges that were valuable to you or to others through you later in life. So your past situations and challenges from which you learned and took out lessons that were valuable to you or through you. Sometimes you could have been a channel for somebody else's help later in life, right? Do you see God's hand in your life through these past experiences? When you look back in retrospect, do you see that this past prepared you for something that was valuable for you or for others through you? That's our breakout question. Yep. So I think we will wind up. We are close to 1 hour, 15 minutes. So just leave you with this verse, Philippians 1:6. Philippians 1:6, for I'm sure of this very thing, that the one who began a good work in you will perfect it until the days of Christ Jesus. So the Lord has begun a good work in each and every one of us, and he will take it to completion. So just leave you with that thought. Our next study will be from 1 Samuel chapter 18 on 11th April. So we miss one Sunday, which is the Easter Sunday next week.